Victor had never thought that sitting in the wrong chair could be a life-altering mistake. But there he was, halfway through a feast on the planet Zalaris, wondering if polite alien murder was a thing. He had walked into the hall with the confidence of a man who had once survived a bungee jump from a floating asteroid station, only to realize that confidence and alien etiquette were not remotely compatible. The hall was enormous, its ceiling stretching like liquid glass into a haze of hovering lights that refracted in patterns Victor's brain couldn't process. A scent, vaguely metallic but tinged with something like fried ice cream, drifted from the buffet, and he thought it was inviting. It was not. He had taken the chair directly in front of what appeared to be a massive, glowing fruit centerpiece. As he lowered himself, he noticed a peculiar hum in the air, almost like a chorus of bees arguing in unison. The hum crescendoed when a figure appeared, gliding through the room with the elegance of a predator and the casual menace of a gravity storm. Princess Seraphine's ears were impossibly long, tapering almost to the floor when she moved, twitching with every imperfection in the room's etiquette. She stopped a meter away from him, and Victor could feel her attention like a gravitational pull, drawing every awkward thought he had straight to the surface. "Ah," she said, her voice like glass cracking under tension. "You have chosen interesting seating." Victor, desperate to be charming, leaned back and gave a crooked smile. "I like to mix things up," he said. Immediately, the fruit centerpiece fell silent, and Victor realized it was not a fruit centerpiece. It was a ceremonial relic, probably older than the first human colony on Mars and possibly alive. It hummed in indignation. The sound was sharp, piercing, and the entire hall stiffened. "Oh," Victor said, "it's beautiful." That was a lie. Beautiful would have been when the thing was not vibrating and emitting low-frequency pulses that seemed to suggest it wanted to kill him personally. Victor's sleeves caught the edge of the table, tipping over a small, silver bowl of luminescent soup. It flowed across the table like liquid neon, and a nearby advisor jumped to block it, waving his tentacle hands like he was conducting an orchestra. Victor apologized, but he wasn't sure in which language he was apologizing. Universal translator or no, the words came out as a series of unintelligible whistles that might have been offensive in at least 5 dialects. Princess Seraphine arched an eyebrow so high it nearly touched her hairline. "You spill on my guest of honor," she said, her voice low and controlled, "and yet you smile." Victor attempted a shrug, which in human terms is casual, in Zalarian terms apparently equivalent to mockery or preparing for ritual combat. He realized he might be committing a cultural felony. "I spill on everyone equally," he offered, hoping humor might save him. The princess's ears twitched once. He learned later that this was her version of a death glare. Dinner continued with Victor trying desperately to follow rules he didn't know existed. He passed dishes back and forth, not realizing that each dish had a sacred direction and a ritual chant attached to it. When he absent-mindedly asked the floating chef why the soup glowed, it responded by projecting a holographic face that shouted accusations at him in 3 alien dialects simultaneously. Victor ducked, which was interpreted as a sign of humility. The chef nodded once, satisfied, and Victor wondered if he was accidentally doing something right. He tried to engage in polite conversation with the other guests, which consisted of a mix of floating, tentacled, and semi-transparent beings. Every word he said was misinterpreted. When he complimented a senator on his shiny eyes, the senator flared a translucent appendage in outrage. "Do you mock the reflection of my soul?" it demanded. Victor panicked and muttered, "Lovely reflections," which might have been an improvement or an insult. Nobody told him. Princess Seraphine watched him, unmoving except for the twitching of those ears. Victor, in a moment of desperation, decided to attempt a joke. "So, do all royal feasts come with, airborne soup and judgmental light fixtures?" He smiled. The hall did not laugh. One of the holographic chandeliers shivered ominously. Victor realized the joke had failed spectacularly. Then the princess did something unexpected. She chuckled, a sound like a low vibration through crystal. It startled him so much that he leaned back, smacking his chair into a hovering platter that squeaked and drifted away. The court erupted into murmurs. Victor, entirely unprepared, now realized he had a choice. Panic like a sensible human or try to survive by embracing the absurdity of the situation. He chose absurdity. A floating servant glided over and presented him with a glowing tablet. It displayed a single word in symbols he almost understood. Betrothal. Victor blinked. I what? The princess's smile widened just enough to suggest both amusement and lethal intent. You have honored me with your unique participation. You are now engaged. Victor laughed nervously, looking at the tablet. Engaged. He glanced at the spilled soup, the offended senators, and the vibrating centerpiece. You mean like a metaphorical engagement? He realized too late that he had missed the humor entirely. Seraphine's eyes narrowed, and her ears twitched in a way that clearly meant, no, idiot, literal. And so, Victor found himself betrothed to the scariest princess on a planet where etiquette could be lethal. Humor was misunderstood, and gravity could betray him at any moment. He looked at the floating dessert carts, the holographic chandeliers, and the glowing soup, and whispered under his breath, I should have just gone to that boring bar on Mars. The feast ended with Victor being led, rather unceremoniously, through the twisting corridors of the palace. He tripped over invisible rugs, ducked under beams that weren't really there, and accidentally opened a secret hatch that led to a room full of singing, anti-gravity weapons. Each weapon waved at him as if saying hello. Princess Seraphine merely observed, one hand resting lightly on a rail, ears twitching with subtle amusement. Victor had never felt more alive, or more likely to die. Yet somewhere between the glowing soup, the floating swords, and the long-eared princess with eyes that could pierce a soul, he began to think that maybe, just maybe, he could survive this. Or at least make it to dessert without being vaporized. Either way, the adventure had begun. Victor woke the next morning to the sound of his bed, if you could call it that, floating gently 3 meters above the floor. Gravity was optional here, apparently, and he discovered quickly that hopping out of a hovering mattress without consulting the anti-gravity settings could result in a spectacular collision with the wall. He bounced off a glowing console instead, sending a spray of holographic icons skittering across the room. One of them winked at him. Victor waved back, not wanting to offend what might have been an intelligent interface. Breakfast was not a traditional meal. A panel in the ceiling opened and released a small, hovering cube that hummed in a sequence Victor suspected was music, but it might have been a ritual signal of some kind. Inside the cube were floating spheres of food that obeyed complex trajectories, spinning elegantly around each other before landing in front of him. He reached for a bright orange sphere and ended up knocking a smaller green one into a pile of clothes that had no business being there. Clothes in this palace had a tendency to float, shift, and occasionally scold you an alien. Victor ducked as a tunic tried to wrap itself around his head in protest. Princess Seraphine appeared in the doorway, ears twitching with amusement. You will need instruction, she said, and Victor felt the words more than heard them. She had that effect. Even when she wasn't speaking, her presence made the room feel like a tightly wound coil, ready to snap at any moment. Instruction in, Victor asked, carefully avoiding the floating tunic. Everything. Everything, she said. Customs, etiquette, survival. You are now a part of my world. She glided past him, leaving a trail of faint, bioluminescent sparkles in the air. Victor tried to remember if part of being a fiancé was cleaning up after a princess, but that question died in his throat when a small mechanical hound skidded across the floor, narrowly missing his foot. The hound barked in binary. Victor stared. Do you speak? Yes, said Seraphine without looking at him. He only speaks when necessary. Mostly he judges. The hound's eyes glowed and Victor immediately felt judged. Instruction began with the basics. bowing properly, complimenting the ears in exactly the right order, and performing a polite acknowledgement of the palace's central core, a massive rotating crystal that pulsed in sync with the planetary rotation. Victor tried to nod in agreement, but his head collided gently with a low-floating chandelier that insisted on spinning whenever touched. The chandelier seemed to sigh. Victor apologized, and it gave a faint hum, almost like a giggle. He took it as encouragement. Next came the culinary etiquette, which was simultaneously hilarious and terrifying. The dishes moved of their own accord, changing temperature, color, and occasionally texture midair. One plate, a quivering, lavender-colored gelatin, leapt from his hand and tried to stick to the ceiling. Victor chased it across the room while Seraphine observed, ears twitching, a barely there smile on her lips. "Human ingenuity," she said, "clumsy but sometimes effective." Victor grinned, puffing out his chest with pride. "I take it as a compliment." The gelatin hit the floor, bounced once, and stuck to his shoe. He looked down and said, "Well, it's committed to me at least." After breakfast, he was introduced to the palace's court, a kaleidoscope of beings that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions at once. There was a senator whose body refracted light in 6 different colors, a floating advisor who communicated entirely through tentacle gestures, and a cook who refused to be seen, but whose voice sounded like wind chimes arguing about politics. Victor tried to memorize their names, but quickly realized it was easier to memorize the trajectory of the anti-gravity food cubes than the titles of the courtiers. Training continued with more absurd tasks. Learning the proper way to traverse the palace corridors without activating the illusionary walls. Practicing the art of complimenting Seraphine's ears in multiple sequences without offending her. And mastering zero-gravity dining etiquette while dodging floating utensils that occasionally held grudges. Victor tripped over a rug that wasn't there, accidentally activating a holographic flower arrangement that shivered and emitted a cloud of sparkling pollen. The pollen stuck to Victor's hair, making him sneeze in a flurry of sparks. Seraphine watched, suppressing laughter. "You have potential," she said, "though it is buried beneath layers of chaos." Victor tried to respond with humor, attempting a bow that turned into an accidental spin. He ended up facing the wrong direction entirely, nearly toppling a hovering stack of antique tomes. "Chaos is my specialty," he said, grinning. The princess's ears twitched, which Victor took as acknowledgement of a job moderately well done. Despite the constant hazards, Victor began to notice a rhythm to life in the palace. There was a strange poetry to the floating instruments, the hovering furniture, and the unpredictable etiquette. It was a world that demanded attention, wit, and occasional improvisation. He stumbled through each lesson with a mixture of terror and glee, laughing at himself so often that Seraphine sometimes joined in, her laughter low and musical, like crystal chimes resonating in a storm. Later, they were summoned to the palace gardens, a vast expanse of luminescent flora that floated in midair. Gravity was selectively applied here, so Victor had to jump carefully, or he would drift into a cluster of orchids that smelled faintly of ionized metal. Seraphine moved with the grace of someone born to navigate this world, ears brushing past radiant leaves, and Victor followed, arms flailing, occasionally colliding with a wandering plant that seemed to frown at him. "Tell me, human," Seraphine said, "do you enjoy survival through chaos?" Victor considered the question, as he narrowly avoided being impaled by a hovering vine that had the habit of snapping shut without warning. "It's entertaining," he said carefully, "and terrifying, mostly terrifying." The princess's eyes glinted. "Good. You must learn to embrace both. Here, the line between humor and danger is thin and often invisible." By the end of the day, Victor was exhausted, covered in glowing pollen, slightly singed from a minor misfire of a plasma cooking device, and still completely enamored by the elegance and unpredictability of Seraphine. He realized that survival in this palace would require more than clumsiness. It would demand wit, adaptability, and a willingness to laugh at one's own mistakes. As he lay back on his hovering bed that evening, still dodging small floating utensils that hadn't finished their rounds, Victor thought that perhaps being engaged to the scariest princess in the galaxy wasn't just a sentence of doom. Perhaps it was the beginning of an adventure that might just be crazy enough to survive. Victor woke to the hum of the palace, the soft vibration threading through the walls like the heartbeat of Xylaris itself. Today, he realized, would either be his greatest triumph or a spectacularly public failure. He had been awake before dawn, partly from habit, partly from the knowledge that Seraphine's long ears, twitching in the shadows, could detect the faintest hint of fear. He had learned over the past few days that a misstep here wasn't just embarrassing, it could be perilous. Yet somehow, that peril had become strangely exhilarating, a constant game he was gradually learning to play. The palace was in chaos, or as close as it ever got to chaos without the entire structure collapsing. Rumors of a coup had reached Seraphine hours before, delivered by holographic couriers that buzzed like metallic bees, each one carrying more bad news than the last. Victor, for all his human clumsiness, had become her informal strategist, mostly by accident, by thinking aloud while dodging laser drones in the training corridors. Somehow, his improbable suggestions had worked more often than they failed. Today, he would test that luck for real. The rival faction was led by a senator whose light-refracting body made him appear three-dimensional from every angle at once. He had decided that Victor's human ignorance, paired with the princess's amusement at it, was an affront to the honor of Xylaris. They struck in the middle of the palace's anti-gravity conservatory, sending floating furniture, airborne plants, and shards of holographic chandeliers spinning through the air. Victor, wearing a suit that hummed with protective energy fields, tried to keep track of his surroundings, but found himself chasing a floating teapot that seemed bent on hitting him directly in the head. "Human ingenuity," Seraphine said, appearing beside him, her ears flicking with annoyance at the teapot's trajectory. "I see you've embraced chaos once again." Victor ducked, rolled, and accidentally activated a hovering platform beneath them. They zipped across the conservatory like misfired comets, narrowly avoiding a cloud of singing orchids that emitted what could only be described as sarcastic commentary in 5 pitches simultaneously. Victor laughed, partly from fear, partly from sheer disbelief. Their first target was the council chamber, where the senator and his allies had begun broadcasting accusations across the palace's central network, attempting to turn the citizens against Seraphine. Victor had learned that persuasion in this world required both cunning and spectacle. He suggested an impromptu display. He and Seraphine would intercept the broadcast, riding the floating platforms through the chamber, and simultaneously use the palace's holographic projectors to create a visual counter-narrative. Seraphine raised an eyebrow. "You are insane. Call it creative problem-solving." Victor replied, leaping onto the nearest platform. The platforms responded, shifting midair to accommodate his weight, almost as if the palace itself recognized his growing competence. Together, they shot across the chamber. Victor managed, against all odds, to grab a floating console, redirecting the holographic projectors to display the duo in heroic poses, one hand raised, ears streaming dramatically. Seraphine, amused and impressed despite herself, added her own flourish, sending a series of energy pulses that formed protective barriers against the senator's laser drones. The combination of human improvisation and alien precision was chaotic, but effective. By the time the dust settled, the rival faction was disoriented, their plans foiled not by brute force, but by an unusual blend of luck, wit, and spectacularly timed mishaps. Victor found himself laughing, brushing a strand of glowing pollen from his hair, while Seraphine's ears twitched in a way that seemed almost like approval. With the palace secure, they turned to the remaining challenges of their engagement. Victor had learned the rhythms of Xylarian etiquette, able to complement the princess's ears in the correct sequence without incident, navigate anti-gravity dining rituals, and even converse with the court without inadvertently insulting anyone, or at least not catastrophically. Seraphine, meanwhile, had begun to show glimpses of her humanity, moments of quiet curiosity, soft amusement at Victor's persistent clumsiness, and a willingness to share insights into her world that no outsider had ever received. The engagement feast, once a scene of near catastrophe, became a celebration. Victor moved with confidence among the courtiers, occasionally slipping on purpose for comic effect, while Seraphine watched, a faint smile playing at her lips. The floating dishes behaved, the holographic chandeliers refrained from judgmental quivers, and the glowing soup was carefully contained. Victor realized he had grown, not just in skill, but in understanding the alien world, its customs, and the delicate balance between respect and humor. Later, in the quiet of the palace gardens, Victor and Seraphine floated among the luminescent flora, gravity selectively applied so that their movements were effortless yet precise. The hum of the planet seemed to pulse in harmony with their steps. Victor turned to her, hesitant, unsure if he was allowed the familiarity, but Seraphine merely tilted her head, ears brushing the glowing leaves, giving him permission without words. "I never thought I'd survive this," Victor admitted, "let alone enjoy it." Seraphine's smile widened, subtle and rare. "You are unpredictable," she said, "but you are learning, perhaps even thriving." Victor chuckled. "Thriving seems like a strong word. Let's go with mostly surviving, with occasional moments of brilliance." Seraphine's ears twitched in a gesture that Victor, after days of careful observation, interpreted as laughter. He realized that survival, humor, and connection were not separate, they were entwined, and that he had grown enough to navigate all three. By the time they returned to the palace, the court had calmed, the rival faction was subdued, and the planet's daily rhythms resumed their serene chaos. Victor had learned the art of balance, when to act, when to jest, and when to trust in the unpredictable forces of a world so unlike his own. Seraphine, once untouchable and terrifying, had become a partner, a mentor, and in her own rare ways, a friend. Victor, floating slightly above the floor on a friendly anti-gravity platform, looked around the palace. He saw the humor in the floating furniture, the beauty in the chaotic corridors, and the thrill in the challenges that had once terrified him. Engagement to the scariest princess in the galaxy was no longer a sentence. It was a journey that had transformed him from a hapless visitor to a capable, confident participant in a world as strange as it was magnificent. As the stars glimmered outside the palace windows, Victor extended his hand to Seraphine. She took it, ears brushing his shoulder, and for the first time the universe seemed less like a hazard-filled puzzle and more like an adventure they could navigate together. The glowing plants swayed gently in the breeze, the holographic chandeliers shimmered approvingly, and Victor laughed aloud, a genuine, unrestrained laugh. He had survived, he had learned, and he had grown, and somehow, against all odds, he had even found joy in the chaos.